My name is Madison. I am 31 years old. And 6 months ago, my mother stood up at Easter dinner, looked right at me in front of 25 relatives, and announced that I was the only Madison who couldn't put a roof over her own head. She was wrong, but not in the way you would expect. My father, Jeffrey, just nodded along like he always does, a silent enabler to the woman he married. My sister, Jessica, didn't even hide her triumph. She just laughed, a sharp, polished sound, and leaned over with a pitying smile to whisper, "You're jealous, aren't you?" while she sipped her vintage Chardonnay. Have you ever been the black sheep of the family while someone else took the credit for your hard work? Let me know your story down in the comments. I am reading every single one of them. The dining room in our family home has always been a theater of generational lies. And that afternoon, the air smelled like expensive beeswax and unearned arrogance. I watched the steam rise from the honey-glazed ham, the silver utensils catching the light of the heavy crystal chandelier above us. I didn't flinch. In my world, the world of high-stakes biotech research, you learn very quickly that the loudest person in the room is usually the one with the most compromised data. Stephanie, my mother, was in full performance mode. She wore her concerned parent mask, the one she saves for when she wants to draw blood, without leaving a visible scar, in front of witnesses. She leaned against the mahogany table, her eyes scanning the room to ensure she had the undivided attention of every aunt, uncle, and second cousin. She pointed out the elaborate floral arrangements Jessica had supposedly designed, then turned her gaze back to me. Her voice dropped into that specific register, the soft one that sounds like compassion, but cuts like a credit check. She told the room about my struggles, about my cramped living situation, and about how she worried my career in research was nothing more than an unpredictable tech hobby. Beside her, Jessica tilted her head the way people do when they are looking at a sick animal. It was a well-rehearsed display of superiority funded by a debt I was only just beginning to calculate. For years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family. I was the one who worked 14-hour days in a windowless lab while they staged their lives for social media envy. I looked at my father, who was meticulously cutting his ham into tiny, uniform pieces, refusing to meet my eyes. He chose peace over protection a long time ago, and in doing so, he became an accountant for my mother's cruelty. They thought I was the spare, the daughter who rented a studio with a kitchen faucet that dripped on a 3-second cycle, drip, 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 no matter how hard I cranked the handle. They believed I was drowning under a student loan payment of $1,400 a month. They saw a girl who ate frozen vegetables and drove a car with a cracked dashboard. But as I sat there, I realized their love had never been a gift. It was a subscription service, and I was the one footing the bill. My mother measured my worth in square footage, but I was done converting my dignity into her currency. I looked at Jessica's smirking face and felt a cold, sharp clarity. This wasn't a family dinner anymore. It was an audit, and the Madison family was about to find out just how much they truly owed me. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain that I had just closed a major contract, or that my title at Thornberry Biotech now came with a corner office and a seat at the executive table. Defending yourself against a liar only gives them a stage, and I was done being the supporting character in Stephanie's drama. Instead, I took a deliberate sip of my tea, feeling the warmth against my lips, and reached into my handbag, a purchase I hadn't told anyone about. I pulled out 2 thick, cream-colored envelopes. The paper was heavy, hand-pressed, and the calligraphy on the front was precise. I placed them on the table next to the half-eaten ham, one in front of Stephanie and one in front of Jessica. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the distant chime of the grandfather clock in the hallway. "What is this, Madison?" Stephanie asked, her voice hovering between irritation and curiosity. She picked up the envelope like it might be contaminated. Jessica leaned in, her eyes scanning the high-quality stationery. "An invitation," I said, my voice as calm as a lab report. "I've moved. I'd like you both to join me for tea next Saturday at 2 in the afternoon. It's a new address." Jessica snorted, a sharp sound that echoed in the quiet room. "A new address? What, did you find a basement unit that actually has a window? Or did you finally cave and move to one of those subsidized blocks in the suburbs?" She looked around at the relatives, inviting them to join in her amusement. A few cousins chuckled, their eyes darting between us like spectators at a tennis match. My mother didn't laugh, but her smile was even worse. It was patronizing. "Honey, if you needed help with a security deposit for a better apartment, you could have just asked. You didn't need to make a formal production out of moving into another rental." I didn't blink. I didn't correct her. In that moment, I realized that my compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, and the account was now officially closed. This wasn't a family gathering, it was a transition of power. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my navy blouse. Saturday at 2, I repeated. I'll text you the access code for the gate that morning. Don't be late, I have a very busy schedule. The gate? Jessica teased, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Is that what they're calling the chain link fence around the trailer park these days? I didn't answer. I didn't look back. I simply walked toward the door, the rhythm of my heels striking a firm, rhythmic beat against the floor, a sound that felt like the closing of a ledger. Behind me, I could hear Stephanie starting to explain to Aunt Patrice that I was probably just going through a phase of delusions of grandeur because of the stress of my job. I walked out into the cool April air, the scent of damp earth and blooming tulips filling my lungs. I got into my car and sat for a moment, looking at my steady hands on the steering wheel. Inside the house, they were laughing at the spare. But in my handbag, I had the keys to a mansion on Beacon Hill, and a bank statement that was about to turn their perfect world into a smoking ruin. This wasn't revenge. It was a long-overdue audit. I need to take you back to a Tuesday night in November, 2022. The night I found the file that reclassified my entire childhood as a series of fraudulent transactions. My apartment back then was a drafty studio near the harbor. The kitchen faucet dripped on that relentless 3-second cycle, drip, drip, drip. I used to think that sound was a reminder of my failure to fix things. But after that night, I knew it was just the countdown to a reckoning. I was digging through a box of old records from Grandma Margaret, the only person who had ever truly seen me. Tucked between old birth certificates was a bank statement for a custodial account opened the year I was born. Beneficiary: Madison. Custodian: Stephanie. The balance on the morning of my 18th birthday had been exactly $90,000. The very next line showed a total withdrawal. Every cent was transferred into a joint account that, 2 weeks later, provided the down payment for Jessica's first luxury condo. The memory of that birthday hit me like a physical blow. I remembered Stephanie sitting me down at the kitchen table, her eyes wet with rehearsed grief, telling me the market had collapsed and my college fund was gone. She held me while I sobbed, then handed me the federal loan paperwork like she was doing me a favor. I spent the next 13 years paying $1,400 every month, working 3 separate jobs, and eating rice in the dark while Jessica posted photos of her marble countertops. I had been the silent investor in my sister's lifestyle, and I hadn't even known I was buying the shares. People often ask why I didn't scream the moment I found that paper, why I didn't storm into their house and demand what was mine. But you have to understand the invisible chains that come with being a survivor. When you grow up in a house where your reality is constantly rewritten to suit someone else's ego, you learn that anger is a luxury you can't afford until you have the leverage to back it up. My silence over the last 4 years wasn't a sign of weakness or a white flag of surrender. It was the methodical preparation of a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. I was collecting data, building my foundation, and waiting for the specimen to move into the exact position I needed for the final analysis. I let them believe I was the unpredictable one, the failure who couldn't keep her head above water, because an underestimated opponent is the most lethal one in the room. In my mind, this wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was an audit of a 15-year-old debt, and I was going to ensure that by the time I was finished, the balance sheet was perfectly, ruthlessly level. Stephanie didn't waste time after that Easter dinner. Within 48 hours, she had launched a full-scale smear campaign across every branch of our family tree and half of the social circles in Boston. She made it her mission to ensure everyone believed I was a lost cause, an unemployed charity case who was failing at that computer thing I did. She didn't ask how my research was going. She didn't ask if I was actually working. She just called people to sigh about how I was drowning and how she was so worried I'd never find a path. It's a classic move. If you steal a child's foundation, you have to spend the rest of your life convincing people that the child was too weak to stand anyway. On November 17th, my 31st birthday, Jessica decided to deliver her own version of a celebration. She didn't send a text. She didn't call. Instead, she posted a meticulously staged photo of her newly remodeled kitchen, $60,000 worth of white quartz, custom cabinets, and gold-plated fixtures. The caption was a masterclass in passive aggression. So grateful for this space, thanks to a mother who always knows which children to prioritize. Some of us choose success, others choose to be a burden. I was sitting on a high-back stool in the lab at Thornberry Biotech when the notification popped up. The blue light of my phone screen cut through the sterile shadows of the room. I didn't feel a sting. I didn't feel the urge to cry. I simply looked at the data, scrolling across my second monitor, and adjusted my spreadsheet. While they were busy curating a life of stolen luxury, I was leaning into the grind. I was working 14-hour days, sometimes 16, disappearing into genomic sequences and protein folding simulations. I lived on cold coffee, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I was the primary architect of a research breakthrough that a major pharmaceutical conglomerate was already scouting. The lab was my sanctuary, a place where numbers don't lie, and character is measured in precision, not square footage. I stopped sharing my life with them entirely. Every time Stephanie waved off my career as a hobby, I just moved another portion of my paycheck into my secret investment account. I let them talk. I let them treat me like a charity case. My mother needed that narrative to cover her tracks. If I was a failure, then her management of my fund was just a practical necessity, rather than an act of theft. She was buying her reputation with my $90,000, but I was building an empire in the dark. I was a scientist observing a dying cell. I knew exactly when the infection would take over. And as I watched Jessica's legs climb on her stolen kitchen photo, I realized that their power was just an illusion, a loan they'd never be able to repay. The silence between us grew into a fortress. To the family, I was the invisible daughter renting a basement. To my team at Thornberry, I was the relentless force behind a discovery that would soon change my tax bracket forever. I was fine with the discrepancy. I was done seeking their validation. I was just waiting for the moment when the Madison family's debt finally came due. The market realized my worth long before my mother ever did. While Stephanie was busy narrating my failure to anyone who would listen, my cancer research project at Thornberry Biotech was undergoing a different kind of scrutiny. A global pharmaceutical conglomerate wasn't interested in my square footage or my lack of a husband. They were interested in my intellectual property. When the acquisition closed, the shift was instantaneous and absolute. I didn't just get a promotion. I got a new reality. My salary jumped to $420,000 a year, but the real weight came from the stock options, a payout that converted 13 years of invisible grinding into 8 figures of liquid assets. I sat in my corner office, looking at the digital transfer confirmation, and felt a cold yet clinical satisfaction. This wasn't a windfall. It was back pay for every meal prep chicken breast and every 3-second cycle of that dripping faucet. I didn't buy a flashy car or post a celebratory photo to social media. I had a much more specific acquisition in mind. I quietly established an anonymous trust, hiding my name behind a wall of legal shell companies. I wanted to move in total silence. My target was the Madison family mansion in Beacon Hill. It was a sprawling $8,500,000 historic landmark that my mother had lost to the bank years ago because she couldn't choose between a legacy and a frivolous lifestyle. For years, that house had been the symbol of what the Madisons used to be, before Stephanie traded our foundation for a temporary spotlight. Now, it was coming back to a Madison, just not the one she expected. I watched the closing documents arrive in my inbox with the same precision I used for a clinical trial. Each signature I provided was a brick in a fortress they would never be able to breach. I moved in on a rainy Tuesday, the gray Boston sky matching the steel in my resolve. No moving trucks, no family announcements, just a locksmith changing the codes on the massive iron gate. I stood in the grand entryway, my footsteps echoing against the original marble floor, and realized that my mother's narrative had finally run out of pages. She thought she had written me out of the story, but I had just been waiting for the right moment to buy the entire book. The stage was set, the invitations were out, and the tea was finally beginning to cool. 3 days before the tea at Beacon Hill, Uncle Robert met me at a quiet corner table in the back of a library, where the only sound was the muffled turning of pages and the heavy weight of history. Robert had been a family law attorney for 30 years, a man who saw people at their most desperate and their most dishonest. He didn't offer a hug or a platitude about family reconciliation. He simply placed a plain manila folder on the table between us and tapped it with a steady finger. "I looked through the archives of your great-grandmother Eleanor's estate, Madison," he said, his voice low and gritty. "We already knew about the $90,000 college fund Stephanie drained. But that was just the appetizer. This is the main course." I opened the folder. The documents inside were dated 5 years ago, around the time Jessica was launching her failed boutique marketing firm. I felt a familiar chill as I scanned the lines. It was a distribution of assets from Eleanor's trust. Beneath a clause for a $150,000 payout, to me, was a signature. It looked like my handwriting. The same loop on the M. The same sharp slant on the N. But I hadn't signed it. I had been on a research vessel in the middle of the Atlantic that week, 1,000 miles away from a notary public. "She forged it," I whispered, though it wasn't a question. She did, Robert confirmed. And she had a friend at the title company notarize it without you being present. That $150,000 went directly into a business account for Jessica. This isn't just a family disagreement anymore, Madison. This is a state-level criminal offense. Fraud, forgery, grand larceny. I stared at the ink. I didn't feel the explosion of anger I might have felt years ago. Instead, I felt the clinical detachment of a researcher studying a terminal infection. I began to understand the illusory power of an empty wallet. Stephanie and Jessica were addicted to the image of wealth, to the high of being the successful Madisons, even when that success was built on a foundation of theft. Their status was a house of cards, and they had used my future as the glue to keep it from falling. They clung to their white quartz countertops and their designer bags because, without them, they were hollow. Their perceived power was just a loan they had overdrafted from my life. Stephanie wasn't a mother. She was a predator wearing a lavender cardigan. She hadn't just taken my money. She had attempted to steal my identity to fund my sister's delusions. I closed the folder with a sharp snap that echoed through the quiet room. I looked at Robert and gave him a single, methodical nod. My anger was no longer loud. It was transactional. I had the numbers. I had the documents. I had the deed. The audit was complete, and the balance sheet showed a deficit that Stephanie could never hope to fill with excuses. "Keep the originals in your safe, Robert," I said, standing up and smoothing my coat. "I only need the copies for the tea party. I want them to see exactly what color the ink is when the law finally comes for them." Saturday arrived at exactly 2 o'clock, the gray Boston fog clinging to the iron spikes of the Beacon Hill gate. My phone buzzed with a notification. 2 cars were idling at the entrance. I sat at the head of the 16-foot maple table in the grand dining room, the same room my mother used to describe with a mixture of longing and bitterness, before she lost it all. I didn't rush. I took a slow, methodical sip of my tea and pressed the remote release for the gate. I heard the heavy iron grind open, followed by the crunch of tires on the cobblestone driveway. Then, the sound of heels, sharp and hurried, approaching the massive oak front doors. When the chime echoed through the vaulted foyer, I let it ring for 10 seconds. I wanted them to feel the scale of the silence. I walked to the door and pulled it open. Stephanie was wearing her best designer trench coat, her hair styled into a perfect frozen wave. Jessica stood behind her, clutching a boutique shopping bag, her eyes already darting around the entryway, looking for something to criticize. "Madison, for heaven's sake!" Stephanie started, her voice echoing off the marble. "We've been sitting at the gate for 5 minutes. And what is this? Did you get a job here as a house sitter? I told you that computer thing wouldn't last." Jessica pushed past her, her mouth hanging open as she took in the silk wallpaper and the original crystal sconces. "Wait, is this the old Madison estate? Mom, look at the crown molding. Madison, who are you working for? Is the owner here? We really shouldn't be wandering around the main hall." I didn't answer. I simply turned and walked back toward the dining room, my heels striking a firm, rhythmic beat against the floor. "The tea is in here," I said, my voice as flat as a digital readout. They followed me into the dining room, but they didn't sit. They stood like tourists in a museum, confused by the scale of the reality they were witnessing. On the table, next to the porcelain cups, I had laid out 2 sets of documents in clear, professional folders. "Sit down," I said. It wasn't a request. Stephanie sank into the velvet-backed chair, her concerned mother mask beginning to slip. "Madison, this has gone far enough. If you're using your employer's dining room to play make-believe, you're gonna get fired." This is exactly the kind of drama I was talking about at Easter. I reached for the first folder and slid it across the polished wood. "That is the deed to this house, Mom. It was finalized last Tuesday. My name is the only one on the title. I didn't get a job here. I bought the legacy you threw away." The silence that followed was absolute. Jessica's shopping bag hit the floor with a soft thud. Stephanie's face went from pale to a ghostly, translucent white. Her fingers began to twist the hem of her cardigan, the same frantic gesture I'd seen her use right before she lied to me 13 years ago. "How?" Jessica whispered, her voice cracking. "You were broke. You were renting a basement. I let you believe what you needed to believe to keep your narrative alive," I said. "But while you were staging your life with my stolen future, I was building a reality you can't even comprehend." I slid the second folder forward. This one contained the bank records Uncle Robert had found. "We need to discuss the $90,000 you withdrew on my 18th birthday to fund Jessica's condo. And we definitely need to talk about the signature on great-grandmother Eleanor's estate papers." I tapped the line where my name had been forged. That's a $150,000 payout that I never saw. It's also a state-level felony. Stephanie lunged for the paper, but I pulled it back. She began to sob, the rehearsed grief finally replaced by raw, disorienting terror. Madison, please. I did what was best for the family. We're blood. You can't do this to your own mother. I looked at her, and for the first time, I felt the clinical detachment of an auditor closing a failed account. You're right, Mom. We are blood. But today, you don't have a daughter. You only have a creditor. And this creditor is calling in the debt. In full. Immediately. The panic in that grand dining room didn't end with a hug or a tearful reconciliation. It ended with a systematic liquidation. Stephanie and Jessica didn't have a choice, not if they wanted to avoid a state penitentiary. Within weeks, Jessica's pristine townhouse, the one with the $60,000 kitchen she used to shame me on my birthday, was listed on the market. The white quartz countertops and the brass fixtures were sold to pay back a debt that had been accruing interest for 15 years. They traded their curated image for their freedom, and even then, it wasn't enough to make the Madison family balance sheet truly even. I am standing on the wraparound deck of the Beacon Hill mansion right now, watching the sun dip below the Boston skyline. The city is beginning to glow with amber and violet light, but I am not looking at this view as a trophy. To my mother, a house was always a stage for a performance. To me, it is a boundary. This door has a deadbolt that I paid for, and for the first time in my life, I am the only one who decides who gets the key. I don't hate them. Hate is an emotional investment I am no longer willing to make. They are simply a closed account in a ledger I have finally balanced. I want to speak directly to those of you who have ever been labeled the outsider or the invisible one in your own family. If you are currently sitting at a kitchen table listening to a faucet drip, wondering when it will be your turn to stand up, listen to me. Never mistake your patience for cowardice. Silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it is the most lethal strategy you have. While they are busy performing for an audience that doesn't care, you can be building a foundation they will never be able to breach. You do not owe them a loud confrontation, but you owe yourself the truth. My mother can still knock on this door, but she can no longer walk in and rearrange my furniture or my story. I have reclaimed my name, my future, and my peace. If you are ready to stop playing by rules you didn't build, hit subscribe. Share this video with one person who needs to know that their silence is actually their strength. Thank you for staying until the end. I will see you in the next journey.